Hi guys, I'm Alex from Sanzu Fabrications, and these shoulder pauldrons are terrible. In this video, I'm going to show you how I went from these to some shoulder pauldrons actually worthy of Marth. This is part 2 in my Marth cosplay series. If you want to see part 1, where I cover the construction of the breastplate, then make sure you visit my channel. I knew for the shoulder pauldrons I was going to have to break this up into several parts, so I decided to start with the main pauldron itself. Now, this was the first time I've ever made shoulder pauldrons, so I had to get the shape right with the pattern. I did this by finding a small bowl, covering it with plastic wrap, then computer paper, and then masking tape. This thing put up a fight like you wouldn't believe, but I eventually got the shape just right. I drew out the shape of the pauldron, making sure to mark down the center of it. That way, when it came time to cutting out and making the pattern, I only had to do 1/2 while still being able to keep it symmetrical. Once it was all ready, I added some darts to it so I could get it to lay flat, and then cut out the half of the pattern that I liked the best. At this point, I was assuming that the pattern I had was going to be perfect. So I traced it onto some poster board so that I would have a durable version of the pattern that I could reuse, since I would have to actually make 4 of these shapes, 2 for each pauldron. I darkened those lines and then I cut it out with an X-Acto knife. With the whole pattern cut out, we moved on to transferring that shape onto our EVA foam. Just like every other pattern, I pinned it down so it wouldn't slide around as I was tracing it. Then I took out my super sharp X-Acto Blade and cut it out of the EVA foam. Remember, I have to do this a total of 4 times, 2 for each pauldron, because like Marth, I also have 2 shoulders, each of which requires its own pauldron. Once everything was all cut out, I applied a good amount of heat and then molded everything into shape. And this is where the problems began to come up. I added some contact cement and did not wait a full 20 minutes like I should have. So when I started to glue everything together, the contact cement wasn't ready and it just kept pulling apart, which led to these huge, terrible, awful looking gaps that you see me fighting against. It would be super easy for me to not show you any of this and just pretend that everything came out perfect the first time around, but I think it's really important to share with you that this is a learning experience for me, and I'm making mistakes as I go, and it's okay if you make mistakes too. We're all learning, and mistakes are how we get better. And now, for your consideration, I will present to you my horrible, terrible, no good, very bad shoulder pauldrons. You can see the seams aren't closed, they're the wrong shape, they're too flat. A lot of issues with them. Now, this is probably the most important step in this entire part. I went back to my pattern, looked at what was wrong, and tried to correct it to match what I wanted to build. And I think that's an important lesson for anyone who's creating anything. Try to be as objective as possible, look at what you have, and try to distinguish the difference between that and what you want. That's how you can make your work better. That's how you grow as an artist. Alright, I am sorry, I did not mean for that to be so philosophical. I digress. You can see I was using common things that I had around my work area, such as my work bowl and a couple disposable cups to get the right curves and the shapes. And I kept going back to the pattern and adding curves to where I thought the pauldrons needed curves. I kept revising it until I was happy with it. And This is the pattern I ended up going with because I really liked it, but it's important to note that during this whole process, I was completely ready to go back and revise it even further if necessary. So you can see I'm putting little notches in the pattern. These are registration marks so that when I'm gluing two halves together, I can make sure that they're lining up properly. That's actually a technique that I learned from Evil Ted Smith's channel. He does a whole bunch of completely jaw-dropping EVA foam crafts. I've learned so much from just watching his videos, and if you're really interested in crafting things with EVA foam, you definitely want to check out his channel. I sanded the dart to that piece and added some glue to it so that it could set for 20 minutes while I was cutting out the other half of the pauldron. What you're seeing now is me just repeating all of those steps again on the second half of the pauldron. Waiting that 20 minutes for that contact cement to set made all the difference. I am struggling with these pieces a lot less. They are going together, they're creating solid bonds that are holding. Even more importantly, the seams to the pieces are staying closed, and that's minimizing their visibility in the project. Now, to get that perfectly round shape that I wanted so badly, I was looking for something to do to hold this in place, and I found that work bowl. I just heated the entire pauldron, shoved it in there, and put it in the freezer. When the EVA foam cools down, it holds the shape that it's in, and putting it into the freezer means I didn't have to hold it in that shape as long. With the pauldrons done, the next thing to work on was the Flourish. This took me quite a few hours to get down. I decided to do it on graph paper because that would let me keep it symmetrical, and I had more control over the curves because I could kind of measure everything out. The first one that I drew from the reference, I held it up to the pauldron and it was twice as big as it had to be. So I actually had to redraw it, which is what you can see on the right. What I'm doing on the left is redrawing that, and I'm only redrawing half of it because I'm going to do what I was doing with the other patterns before. I'm only going to cut out half of it. I actually don't have to make this pattern exactly to the scale I want because you're going to see a little later. I'm going to hit the craft foam that I put this on with my heat gun, and that actually shrinks it a little bit. So it makes the pattern a little smaller. Oh, and don't worry, this was just as tedious as it looks. And you guessed it, when I finally got that cut out, I folded some poster board in half, traced it onto that poster board, and cut that out with an X-Acto knife. I know it sounds like I'm complaining about doing all these tiny little tedious things, but I actually really enjoyed it. It was super relaxing for me, and oddly enough, I kept looking forward to getting home so that I could continue working on it. And with that, I had my pattern for my flourishes all done. It was time to transfer that onto some craft foam, and I found that the best way to do that was just dab around the pattern with a permanent marker. If I tried to draw anything out or trace it, it would just move the pattern around just a little bit and things would start to get warped. So if you're planning on doing any tiny little details using craft foam in a pattern, just dab. Take your time and dab it with a permanent marker. Now this part is actually playing at double speed so that you can see the foam start to shrink. and that actually made it a little easier to get smaller flourishes for my armor. And after that, all I had to do was repeat that whole process 3 more times. But don't worry, I am going to spare you from watching all of that again. The next step was doing the trim for the shoulder pauldrons, and I actually couldn't rely on my original pattern for this because I traced the pattern onto the textured side of the EVA foam. The reason I did this was because the pattern was made to fit snugly on my arm, and if I traced it onto the outside of the shoulder pauldron, then it would have made the whole thing too tight. So I kind of had to find a new way to make up the patterns for the trim. I created this new pattern by covering the border of the pauldron in painter's tape, then peeling that off and sticking it onto some poster board so I could trace out the shape. Now I had to put a seam in this pattern, and I decided to put the seam at the very top of the shoulder pauldron because if you look at Marth's design, that area is most likely going to be covered by his cape. So that was the easiest place to hide it. I measured the border, then I measured in an inch, in another 1/4 inch, and then in 1 more 1/4 inch because I wanted the smallest border to match the border on his chest armor. Once I was satisfied with all the lines, I went back, darkened them, and then finally cut all of them out with an X-Acto knife. And I think you know what comes next. I used that pattern to trace out the shapes onto some craft foam, and then cut that out with an X-Acto knife. I made the larger border thicker than it needed to be so it would hang off the shoulder pauldron. That way I could glue it on and then trim off the excess so that it lined up perfectly. When I glued on these borders, I didn't wait the full 20 minutes for the glue to set, so that in case I had to make any adjustments to the border's position, I could pull it off the pauldron without tearing the foam. I also made the border slightly longer than it needed to be so that I could make sure it lined up and then trim off the excess at the very top of the pauldron. Once everything was glued on, I went back and lightly sanded over the inside of the border to round it off just a little bit. Since the smaller border was the same width as the distance between the two borders, I used it as a measurement for the distance. So I just used a normal pen to mark where the outside of the smaller border would be placed. I added a little contact cement to the smaller border and then applied it the exact same way that I added the larger one. Once the two borders had been applied, I lightly sanded over the seam in the center of the pauldron. I should have either added some quick seal or sanded it a bit more because it's still visible in the final product. But despite this, I still like how it came out. Then I got my flourishes all ready to be glued on by very gently adding glue with a scrap of EVA foam. I had to be very careful when I was placing these because the center of the flourish moved around a lot, and I wanted to make sure that it was glued perfectly straight. With everything glued on, I took the pauldrons outside and cleaned up the edges with a mouse sander. I also went back with a Dremel tool and rounded off the insides of the edges and the insides where the straps would be glued. Any sanding to the borders or the flourishes had to be done by hand as to prevent any damage. Speaking of damage, once all the sanding was done, I went back inside and marked out some battle damage with a pen. and then I went over with a heat knife and carved it in. Remember, when you're using a heat knife on foam, to open your windows or be in a really well ventilated area, because this creates an unusually large amount of smoke. Once I finished the battle damage, I cut out 2 strips of polypropylene and then marked off where they would be glued on the pauldrons. I added some contact cement to these areas and contact cement to the polypropylene so that it could soak into the fabric so it would hold better. I let that sit for the full 20 minutes, and then I glued the straps onto the pauldrons. Once I was confident that the straps had been completely glued on, I masked them off with some painter's tape and took everything outside so I could add a couple layers of Plastidip in order to prime everything for painting. Once the Plastidip was dry, I removed the masking tape, and now I have 2 battle damaged pauldrons all ready to be painted. Thanks for watching, guys. If you enjoyed this video or you learned something from it, be sure to leave a like. If you want to see more videos like this, then be sure to subscribe. I'll see you later. Have a great day.